When did you guys figure out that everything will be powered by APIs and APIs are going to be the interface for every single software interaction?
In 2002, there was this memo from Jeff Bezos in Amazon to his entire engineering team, essentially mandating that all communication between services must happen through APIs, right? No shared memory, no shared DB. Everyone has to use an API, right? But it took a long time for that learning to spread out, maybe from Amazon and a few other places, to a point where it became almost the de facto way of doing things. Postman started off as Abhinav's hobby project, right? He and Ankit were working at Yahoo together, and this was a scratch your own itch sort of effort when it started. There was this very interesting post on Stack Overflow, which we still quote, right? Someone asked, how do I simplify my API workflow? And there was an answer from Abhinav. That was a source of huge user leads for us, right? A lot of the early users we had on our Chrome app was through that answer.
Hello everyone, I'm Abhishek, co-founder of gradCapital. Today we have Abhijit, who's co-founder of Postman. We have another Abhishek. He's a co-founder of Rocket Networking, and he's currently a fourth year student at BITS Goa. And we have Gaurav, he's co-founder of Nudge, and he's also our portfolio company. He was at Venkateshwar College and is building a technical product and have many customers. And today we'll all have conversations. I'll just introduce gradCapital a bit to get a sense of like what kind of audience we engage with and what we do. Personally about me, I studied physics in college in BITS, and my first job was at UC Berkeley as a researcher. I never wanted to be a founder. I never wanted to be an investor. Like none of those things had come to my mind. But I wanted to take a break from research and just like one day at a time. And it suddenly, after I came back to India from US, and we had an observation that there are many young people who are experimenting ideas on campuses, but there are not many people giving out money to them. And it felt like it's an arbitrage of where there are exceptional people, but nobody wants to touch them. And historically, they have built great companies. Like obviously, like Facebook and Google are examples. But even in India, like Grey Orange came out of BITS as a college project. Either came out as a college project. So it just felt like hey, we could do something about it. So we started gradCapital, and like the intuition behind like gradCapital was that hey, young people have very different traits as compared to older people. Young people are more like they're more irrationally optimist. They work with friends and wingies, like it's just much easier. They work with less amount of money. And the intuition they have about the world is much more pure and objective sometimes. Like they may start with low hanging fruits, easy ideas, but feels like they can learn really fast and they can build an intuition really quickly and learn fast. So that's really how and we also learned that larger funds and other funds typically want to write larger checks because they're also in a capital management business. So it felt like who would give small amount of money for students to experiment, because what we are doing is a small amount of money. So that's why like very less people try to do it, and that became a reason to exist. And in India, there have been like many examples that started as college before we did like either Grey Orange, Oyo. So we thought, we could give small amount of money to young people and trigger them into starting a company. We started with writing a $25,000 check for 4% in 2021. And we funded a batch of 18 companies. Like 6 went to the next stage, like 1 got acquired, 5 raised the seed round or whatever, and 2 actually did their Series A now, just they're in the process of closing. So that compelled us to say that, hey, something is working right. And the big question a lot of people had was, hey, you're giving money to part-time people, right? They're not even full-time. And first question VCs have is, hey, are you full-time? If you're not full-time, don't talk to us. And most people said, hey, you're giving money to part-time people, they'll use it in parties or like get a CV point and get a job. But none of the 18 people actually did that and ended up being full-time. Many of them got like millions of users, multiple enterprise contracts, built a hardware product with customer, and it became more of a company from a project. So So that got us here, and we didn't have lots of money, and we moved to this house, gradCapital house, recently. It was just Prateek and I living in our places, individual places, and working out of our houses. And 4 months ago we got this. So today it's also like we just invited everyone for this gradCapital house and a session with Abhijit. Abhishek, why don't you like introduce? These two are fans of Postman, so I thought I'll invite.
Absolutely. So, way APIs are created and tested. So you could create APIs, share them, and totally streamline this API development experience for your team. And it was a game changer in this whole API space. And yeah, and I use it a lot personally.
I personally use Postman every day. I was just using it like right before this. I mean, all the APIs that we use for our product are all managed inside Postman. I mean, it's not just like just testing and just building. It's also the collaboration aspect of Postman that has just been super seamless for us to integrate within our workflows that we do inside our team. And yeah, I mean, we love Postman. I mean, we use it every day, and it has been we have seen Postman changing over time, and the new features that have been built inside Postman. So I mean, I just wanted to start by asking you, what does your day-to-day look like in Postman? Like what does like a normal day for you look like inside Postman? Like what are you doing? And like if you could tell us, speak a little bit about like how did actually when did you guys figure out that everything will be powered by APIs, and APIs are going to be the interface for every single software interaction?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question, right? So I think one thing that I always maintained that was critical to Postman's growth was us starting at the right time. I think that was very important. So I think one important sort of incident that happened that we often quote in our story is in 2002 there was this memo from Jeff Bezos in Amazon, right, to his entire engineering team, essentially mandating that all communication between services must happen through APIs, right? No shared memory, no shared DB. Everyone has to use an API. That was in 2002, right? But it took a long time for that learning to spread out, maybe from Amazon and a few other places, to a point where it became almost a de facto way of doing things. So after I graduated, I was in Walmart in India for a year. Within Walmart, everyone was doing microservices, ESB, SOA, basically different terms for essentially composing software through APIs. Few batchmates and friends of mine who were at similar scale companies, everyone was doing the same thing, right? So this was one signal, right? That, okay, everyone is working with these similar building blocks. And one other insight that we had was that tooling for this was largely absent, right? There was a lot of, and I was an entry-level developer there, right? My first year out of school. And everyone had tools for version control and CI/CD and code review and all of these things. But APIs were this new vocabulary term that was emerging. And everyone was building their own internal stack, so to speak. And this was almost universally seen across Indian companies, US companies, small companies, big companies. Anyone we spoke to, there was some pain point felt around this, some internal stack being developed. And this was a time when Abhinav, who was our CEO, was working at Yahoo. So he was also facing the same problem there, that all my work is making APIs and invoking APIs. Where do I store those calls? How do I optimize my workflow? So I think there was this independent sort of discovery of insights. That is what was the first seed for this idea that is there value in exploring this space. Now, Postman started off as Abhinav's hobby project, right? He and Ankit were working at Yahoo together, and this was a scratch your own itch sort of effort when it started. There was this very interesting post on Stack Overflow, which we still quote, right? Someone asked, how do I simplify my API workflow? And there was an answer from Abhinav. That was a source of huge user leads for us, right? A lot of the early users we had on our Chrome app was through that answer, right? And one signal that we started seeing after this was that there was a very strong need for collaboration, which Postman didn't support. But users were emailing Postman collections to their friends and their teams, and they were importing it. So there was this large out-of-product collaboration loop that we were able to observe. And when we thought more about it, that made a lot of sense, right? Because APIs are inherently collaborative, right? You have to have two people, two teams communicating. And I think that's where it started, right? We also, I think, validated that hypothesis by talking to a very wide spectrum of Postman users, some of them working in startups, some of them individuals, freelancers, right to VPs of large companies. And everyone sort of aligned with this API and collaboration problem statement, that you have multiple personas who are interested in this abstract artifact called an API. Tooling around that is suboptimal. We spend a lot of time building tooling around APIs because it's out-of-the-box tooling is absent. So I think that's where the journey started. Over time, I think as we sort of started building out our collaboration features, we also started thinking about what this could mean for the future of software, right? And I think one idea that all of us found very appealing was that if you say zoom out to a 40, 50-year time scale, right? How hard was it to develop software 50 years ago, right? The entry barrier was very high. You needed to have access to like a university mainframe. You needed, PhD or something, right? Like entry barrier was very high. The number of developers in the world was maybe 5K, 15K, right? And now that has changed so much, right? Like the three of us could, literally be sitting in a room or a house not very different from this, and use AWS for infra, use Stripe for payments, use Google for auth, and all of these things were instant, right? So it's so much easier to build software now, and APIs are a big part of that. So we said, okay, what is Postman's vision, right? Why do we exist? And I think one problem statement or one vision statement that we found appealing was that we want to make software development easier. We want to, say, create the next 100 million connected developers, which is what our vision statement is. And we found that APIs could be a very, very important part of that. So I think that constancy of vision for us has been important. But yeah, I think I hope that provided some context on how we got started into first being an individual productivity tool and then expanding to a collaboration-centric platform.
For example, you spoke about design, right? The URL bar of the Postman. I mean, it's really fascinating how there are some iconic design features that are there inside Postman that like you just look at that URL bar and you know that this is like Postman centric. So is this, was this your focus from day one that you wanted to stand out as a product, or was it just purely you wanted to make it as much simple to use as much as you wanted to do it for your end users?
I think simplicity was certainly the goal, right? Because even what we used to do earlier was, copy paste curl commands into a Google Doc, and that's how the earlier versions of Postman were built because we didn't have Postman then. So simplicity was a very, very clear goal for us, for sure. I think standing out as a product, that was the side effect of, I think, being able to solve the right problem for the right persona at the right time, right? Like if we had sort of started 2 years before we did or 2 years after we did, we probably would not have been having this conversation. So I think that was super critical, and then bunch of decisions along the way, right? Like just the fact that we invested a lot in collaboration, right? People being able to share collections from their websites, right? Like those small viral loops that were seemingly small but ended up being very important. I think that led to the situation where Postman is, as you said, the de facto API tool. And that slowly led to a situation where we know for us that interface that you described, the URL bar, etc., that's so central to so many users' idea of what Postman is that it's hard to sort of change, right? Because as you said, it is what most people think of when they think of API client now, right? So I think it's a little bit of both, right? It's an effect of the set of users that we were able to get. But yes, I think simplicity was the goal that we started out with for sure.
What was your first year of like Postman like? Like it was probably taking lots of leap of faiths and knowing something like in your first year, some things for certain, but there are a lot of unknowns and you're just banking on those certains, like those small hints and facts, small moments of traction that sort of basing your whole life on. So what was that like? And what was also your pitch what was the first pitch to the first investor? Yeah.
Got it. I think first year was a lot of fun, to be honest. As you said, right? Like there was a lot of experimentation for sure. I think one thing that, or two things that we did right. One was keep the iteration cycle very, very short. Two was be like maniacally obsessed with talking to users, right? Because development is an activity where like everyone has a slightly different workflow, and you really stand the risk of going into your own sort of thought process and say, oh, this is what is needed. And at the end of the day, you can always find validation, right? If I want to build X, I can find 10 people who agree with X. That's not, at least for developers, it's not very hard. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't make that mistake. So I think one thing that we had going for us is that we had a very engaged user community. I think one thing that worked is that the developer-to-developer interaction was always very honest, right? Whether it is GitHub or Stack Overflow or anywhere we went to, right? It was not, and this was the time when Postman was free, right? So this impression that someone is trying to sell me something, that was not there. It was developer-to-developer open communication. So I think we got a lot of frank feedback that way, got a lot of insights into pain points that people in different stages of organizations were facing. So I think those are the things that worked really well. But yeah, I mean, we certainly had a lot of experiments that didn't work. But it's not very easy to recognize that early on. So I think some of those features are still there. Some of them we were able to remove. But I think the one ingredient that stood out was keeping the iteration speed really high.
And the thoughts that you started out with, like the hypothesis you started out with, has that completely changed? What has changed and what has not changed in terms of?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the one thing that has stayed constant is the fact or this belief that APIs are this fundamental building block of software. They are at some level more fundamental than code itself, right? I mean, code is the implementation, right? Like now you could have code that a human may write, an AI agent may write, etc. But communication between defined pieces of software is still via API, right? Like everyone is consuming AI also via APIs. So I think that belief has certainly grown stronger for sure. I think parts that have changed, I think not changed, but I think understanding that we didn't have earlier that we have now is what the API collaboration loop in different types of companies looks like, right? Like what would API collaboration in a large auto company look like, right? I mean, we didn't even know auto companies had such a big Postman use case, right? And obviously once you start having that conversation, they'll have internal systems, they'll have their infotainment systems, they'll have their connectivity to their sat-nav provider, like so many different things that we didn't know about when we started. We're like, why would an auto company need Postman? So I think those learnings have developed over time. We have also learned, I think, how to communicate the Postman value prop and the API collaboration value prop to different stakeholders within our companies, right? The way you would talk to a bank is very different from the way you would talk to a software product company, very different from how you would talk to an IT services company. So I think that vocabulary we have learned over time, that messaging we've learned over time. And I think the other thing that has been a learning as well is that it's really hard to change user behavior, right? Like you can paint this grand vision of the world that this is how it should be, everything is hunky-dory here, but how do you get, so we have 30 million users now, right? How do you get 30 million users to change overnight? Not going to happen, right? So I think that has been the other learning, that you need to be smart about how big of a leap are you asking your users to take depending on the stage that they're at.
And your initial set of users, like geographically, like, and who were they? Like, were they like power users? Yeah. And why were they power users if they were?
Why were they power users?
If whoever power users were.
So when we started off, I think US and India were certainly the two biggest markets. Maybe a 60-40 split. Not exactly sure at this point. At that time, Postman functionality was also very limited, so there was not too much of a difference between a power user and a non-power user. I think there were certainly users who were more vocal. There were users who were, I think it's one slight sidetrack, right? One thing that we discovered was that within the global network of developers, right, there are people who are more influential, not in their like social media reach, but in terms of where they stand in the API graph, right? Like say someone who is building an identity sort of API at a large company, right? Like that person has to share their API with every other team, right? So that team or that person would be very central, right? So there were people with different degrees of sort of centrality in this API graph. those were the ones who sort of turned out to be creating more APIs, creating more collections, sharing more collections, and in the end, sort of serving as the engines that would grow that part of the API graph for us. So I think those were the power users, so to speak. Just because they had more APIs to consume and more people to give their APIs to.
And like, did US became your primary market that pays you?
I think that's split. I think what happens is the development teams might be split all over the world. In many cases, the holding company may be US based. So that's certainly where we started. Like the majority of our customer-facing teams were based in the US. Over time, we have seen that grow, right? Like now we have significant presence in the EU, APAC, India, obviously. Middle East is also growing a lot. So I think now it's spread, but if you were to look at numbers, I think US is still obviously very strong.
So like one question that a lot of portfolio founders have is like, if they feel like they're making something that US people can use, but they're in India, how to think about that? Like some people say, first test and build in your backyard, but then some people have an experience of saying that, hey, if you test it in your backyard, you're gonna learn the wrong things. And
I think that differs by space. I think again, for developers, we were fortunate that everyone's backyard looks pretty much the same, right? If you look at how developers work, there may be some practices that start here and go there, or start there and go here, but largely the need, and post 2008, I think the speed of that technology transfer was also very, very rapid, right? So even if say GraphQL came up within Facebook or something, it was very quickly adopted by developers all over the world, and geography was not really something that held them back, right? So I think we were fortunate to operate post that, right? So in fact, we got a few feature requests for supporting gRPC, which came from Google's US team as well as Google's India team, because Google had gRPC developers all over. So I think in the development space, we were very fortunate in that regard for sure. I think people who are building on the hardware side obviously will have a different answer to that, because the problem space looks very different, or it can look very different. That was not really the case for us.
Is it like, do you think that if in order to build for the US market or anywhere where you want to sell, should the founders or the initial team have a taste of that area? Like, should we move there, or should it be you can build? Or do you believe that we can build from India by taking insights?
I think building from India is certainly possible. I think now a lot of things that were harder, say 20 years ago, are not as hard anymore. I think people are a lot more receptive to products that might be coming out from any part of the world. I think it's certainly important to spend some time interacting with different sorts of people, because even though the problem statement might be the same, their reasons for having those problems might be different. How badly they want to solve those problems may be different. So these things can still differ. So I think as long as you're close to users, no matter where they are, that's what's important, and that can be done through multiple means. There may be many reasons from like some part of your team to move or the whole team to move, but I think the key is if you want to look at is the problem statement specific to the US, I think that can be solved in a wide variety of ways.
Understood. And for you to in the initial days of Postman, what were you tracking? What were you looking at? What was your North Star metric, so to say, so that you knew that okay, we're moving in the right direction? Yeah. What was telling you that?
That's a good question. So I think when we started, we said that collaboration again was the one thing that we wanted to build, and our thesis was that the better or the more we enable collaboration, and this is not just collaboration within one team sharing collections, but across the world, right? How quickly can people discover new APIs, whether it happens within Postman or outside, and hopefully some of that comes into Postman. So one early metric that we were tracking was number of collections, right? We actively, even though we were a paid product, revenue is not something that we tracked initially, right? We said, okay, we do want to focus on long-term growth. Long-term growth is going to come from more people creating more APIs. So that's the one thing that we were tracking. That was in fact our go-to metric for a number of years till we had internal team split, where each team started tracking different things. Now I think the most important things we look at are, we have internal ways to track how much a team is collaborating, which is a very, very important driver for us, right? Because that collaboration engine, or the flywheel as we call it, that powers everything else, right? The more people are in that flywheel, the faster the flywheel spins, right? The more we are able to use all of the hundreds of features that we might have. So that is what we track now. But we started with, and we wanted to keep our starting metrics very simple, right? We didn't want to over track and underbuild. So we said, look, let's even if this is not the perfect metric, that's fine. As long as we do the right things, this moves in the right direction. That's all we really need.
So I heard this. I don't know if this is. I just wanted to confirm if this is true or not. Did you guys initially track whenever developers used to post screenshots of their queries or issues that they had inside? Were you also tracking if they had Postman in their desktop dock?
I mean, my eye always goes to someone's Mac dock or Windows status bar to see whether Postman is open or not. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we ever had any formal activity to do that, but yeah, I think it's just become a habit over time. If I see a screenshot, I'll look for is Postman open or not. I think that habit is not going to go away. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how you went from that one Stack Overflow post and just a Chrome web app. So what was the short-term vision then, and how has the vision evolved from that point?
Yeah, so I think short-term vision was, when the Chrome app was built, it was a very scratch your own itch type of project. Over time, we got some insights that, hey, there is appetite for large-scale adoption, right? So in fact, when we went for our seed round, we had around 400K users on the Chrome store, right? Which is high, right? I think that's one more indication that the timing was critical for us, right? Just 1 year after Postman, there were a number of other API clients as well. 6 months before Postman, there weren't any. So I think it was important that we got that timing right of the first launch. I think vision articulation didn't happen for a few years, to be honest, right? I think we were always clear about this idea of APIs being important as the building block, collaboration being important, but articulation of the vision that, okay, APIs can be used to get more people to develop more software. I think that came, 2016 or so on, or thereabouts. And I think we've been fortunate that we have been able to keep that constant, right? I don't think we've had to change that too much. And we have managed to align, most of the things that we are doing with that. So I think that's one thing that we've been able to do well.
I wanted to know, what mistakes did you guys make in the early days that you feel like you could have avoided? Any key mistakes?
Oh boy. So I think as we grew, as I said, there were a number of inflection points that we faced. And I think a lot of the times we were reactive, not proactive in adjusting to that. One story that we tell internally is that we went from 4 people in one room to 8 people across 2 rooms to 20 people across 2 floors in one house, right? Which is four lanes down the road. Then we shifted to an office. Then we had people in the US. And across all these inflection points, we had to figure out different ways of collaborating. And I think this is one area where I think we were reactive, right? If we were to do all of that again, I think we would have been more efficient through all of those growing pains. It certainly led to some situations where we found certain ways of working were not very efficient. We had to reorg again. And I think in hindsight, yes, that has slowed us down. But yeah, I think as long as we're able to identify those issues quickly enough, that's all that we can really hope for. But yeah, I think those were areas that we could have done better at. I think that's one theme. It's not like one single instance, but I think a number of inflection points, I would have ideally wanted to be solving them proactively rather than reactively. I think the other would be the false impression that, okay, you can change user behavior very quickly, right? And I think this is largely product learning, right? Everyone wants to build new features, new workflows, but I think the learning that as you grow, even developers, right? They think of, when in 2014 when we started, Postman had no recall, right? It's just this point tool that you use for this one thing. Tomorrow, if everything changes, I'm still okay. But now there is a lot of inertia, so to speak, that has been built up, right? In users' minds, they've been using it for 8, 9, 10 years. In how collaboration patterns work. So a lot of inertia has been built up. And that inertia is very hard to combat. And I don't think we got a full grip on that till quite recently, right? I think that's one more thing that we realized late. And because it's like as developers, right, because the marginal cost of shipping is very, very low, it's as easy to build a feature today as it was 8 years ago, right? But the cost of adoption is something that we had to learn to take into account over time.
As a young founder, you have to like hire people some older than you or like who are senior from the college or from different colleges, and that somehow like is sometimes in the backdrop of people. How did you do that? Do you say that, hey, don't hire much older people? Like, what's the advice for a young founder who's just 22, 23?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very pertinent question. I think we've faced those very tactical challenges while hiring, right? Like, will this person take me seriously, etc. Yeah. I think those things we've certainly faced. When we were starting out in our first 2-3 years, I think there was a lot of skepticism about startups in general. I think now they're a lot more accepted. For our first 2-3 years, that was one area of skepticism. We had to sort of find people who were excited and whom we thought could like learn on the job. As we grew, yes, we identified certain problems that needed experience to solve, right? Okay, how do you handle an engineering team of like 100 people? Yeah, you want someone who's been there, done that. So I think even there, the formula was, just to harp on why we think APIs are an important space, right? I think because by this time we were able to articulate the vision to some extent. So we just said, okay, people who are excited by this are the people whom we want, because as your requirements get more and more specific, the number of people who fit that bill will go down. And we're like, okay, we can expand our search for sure. We can engage agencies and so on to expand our search. But at the end of the day, the person who we hire needs to be someone who's excited by what we're trying to do, aligns with what we've done so far, and do they see themselves growing with the org or not? So as long as I think those things fit, hiring generally worked out okay.
And like, how did the average age of the team evolve over time?
Yeah, I think when we started, our circles were very limited. Our sort of vocabulary, so to speak, was very limited. Articulation of our problem statement was very, very basic. So the team reflected that. That being said, I think we were extremely fortunate to get a very, very strong early team, right? Like we would not be here if our, say, first 10, 20, 30 hires were not who they were. Over time, I think we were also able to identify problems, right? Even identification of problems is not something that was obvious to us on day one. That happened maybe, say, 2-3 years down the line. I think that's where we started being able to hire more experienced folks. And I think that trend has certainly continued, right? Like now we're at a scale where, there are specific people in specific orgs that we want to hire, right? And there, obviously, age, location, etc., can't be a concern. So yeah, I think that has been the journey over time.
You had mentioned like that there have been quite a lot of inflection points for you guys over time. I'm sure like initially things would just like you mentioned, you were reactive initially, but like over time, how did you prepare for that inflection? Like, was it intentionally you knew that, okay, fine, we're entering this inflection point and now we're going to scale from, let's say, $1 million revenue to a $10 million revenue, and these are the changes we're going to make, or do you do it on the fly? How does that?
I think, so that's one area where investors have been helpful, right? Because they have seen some of their companies grow through similar phases, and even though our domains are different, problem statements are different, they can certainly provide some insights into what to expect. So it has to be that plus your own conviction, right? Because in the VC world, like every company is different, right? Like even though you might have somebody else who's B2B SaaS started in the same space, etc. Like there's still differences that are very specific to your company. So I think you have to bring that in as well. But yeah, I think these insights helped. Also having more experienced folks in the team helped, right? Like if we're able to proactively hire for the next stage of growth, I think the biggest value that person can bring in is helping us to be proactive with how do you deal with, say, the next set of problems you're going to face. So I think hiring in investors, insights, plus obviously speaking to other companies that have been through that. I think these are the only 3 things you can do. Beyond that, there will be so many other forces, right? Like this is not the only force that's pulling you in a certain direction. There are like product things to be built. There's customer pressure. There is annual revenue pressure. All of these things happen. So hopefully all of these sort of forces can combine to push you in the right direction.
And how are these pressures divided amongst you guys? Like you, Abhinav, Ankit, how are you dividing that?
So I think now it's a very, I think one thing that has always been true for us is that there was always a lot of depth to whatever any of us was working on, right? And I think one other realization that also we had is that to continue growing at the level and speed that we want, we need expertise, right? So you want someone who's, say, done sales at a certain level, who's done, say, engineering infra at a certain level or marketing at a certain level. So I think those hires came in, as the need was felt. When we started out, I think the roles were largely overlapping, like everyone was doing everything when we started out. And I think it was, largely what everyone just ended up gravitating towards, right? For example, for the first 2 years, I was doing a lot of user interaction customer support, right? So that was the team I ended up building for the first 2-3 years. And as long as everyone was convinced that there's a lot of depth in what we are doing, I think there was no issue there, right? I think everyone just ended up building and maintaining those teams for a while till it got to a point where, okay, now say a different level of expertise is required where we hire somebody specifically for that. And after that, you move on to the next thing.
So yeah, I had a question about your traction. And has it ever happened that your user traction has not matched with what you wanted to build? So in Postman's early years.
Yeah. I would say for specific features and initiatives, yes. Overall, no. I think for the overall idea of APIs, collaboration, APIs being the central ingredient of development, I think that trend has always stayed strong, fortunately for us. Specific initiatives have certainly failed, right? Like so many small features, big features that we have shipped out. We had an hypothesis. I think one thing that we spoke about earlier is that it's very easy to construct a story and find data points that support your argument, right? But yeah, the reality can often be very different. So we have certainly had our share of that. But yeah, I think the one thing that again has been good for us is that the core notions of the API flywheel, the collaboration loop, everyone having a stake in APIs, that has always worked out well for us, right? For example, even when we were starting out, right, if you went and asked different people in a company, hey, what is an API? Someone would point you to their code, someone would point you to their EC2 instance, someone would point you to their API documentation. And all of these are, they're partly correct, but they're not a complete view, right? And again, this problem was felt very widely. So that problem has not gone away. So I think that traction has stayed, but specific initiatives have not worked. That's obviously been the case. Yeah, I mean, as long as more things work than not, you're good.
And what about so coming to the team? I mean, you mentioned that you've hired people from at different stages with different levels of experience. But at the early days of Postman, the first team, what were you looking for in your first team, and what kind of people did you want in the team? How did you know that this was the right person?
So, I mean, to be honest, we didn't have a lot of choice, right? when we were starting out, right? A lot of people used to say, oh, I've heard about Postman and I didn't know it was an Indian company, right? We got that a lot for our first 3-4 years. Even today, some people say that, right? So, but I think, yeah, to answer your question, curiosity was one, right? And need not be about APIs or anything, but does this person have a demonstrated capability to go deep into whatever they're working on, right? Whether it is software, whether it's hardware, whether it's enterprise software, whatever it is, right? Even people who have just graduated, right? I think there was this huge spectrum we saw in terms of what sort of initiatives people took on their own, right? And it can be anything, right? It can be academic work, it can be hobby work, it can be doing some startup on the side. But any of these things show initiative, show curiosity. I think that was the single most important trait that we were looking for. I think the other thing I'd also say is how well you feel you can have a conversation with them, right? If you are talking to them about, okay, this is how we see APIs changing the world, how receptive to that are they, right? I think these were the two things that we were generally looking for when we started out.
So it's curiosity and how much receptive.
Yeah, I think when we started out, this was certainly the case because, yeah, I mean, we didn't really know how to gauge expertise as such. That as a need came in maybe a little later. But yeah, I think for our first few hires, this is what we were looking for.
And you also said that, when you're talking to customers, you can have an hypothesis and you can always find like 5-10 customers who will sort of agree to that hypothesis, and you can construct probably any hypothesis and find some validation to invest your time and energy into it. Then how do you discover the truth that really this is what you want to go after, if the traditional way of like testing hypothesis and just validating it?
You go back to your investor deck and look at the TAM numbers that you showed. Yeah. No, I think to be honest, like, I think if you're able to define enough segments of customers, right, and you're able to get small traction across that segment, right, and again, you at the end of the day, it is a subjective decision, right? Like, you know, you might say, okay, this idea is not going to work. Someone else has the opposite conviction, so that element does not go away. But yeah, I think just being honest to yourself with regard to, okay, this is my potential customer base. These are the problems I set out to solve. For example, we say, okay, any team should be able to use Postman to collaborate on APIs. If a team is not able to do that, right, it's up to us to find why not, right? And they might have hundreds of reasons, right? They use only WebSockets. We don't support WebSockets. Okay, we should build that if it aligns with us. They have security requirements that we don't support. Okay, do we build that now or in 5 years? So I think that question is something that we ask ourselves all the time, right? Why does every company in the world not use Postman, right? And there are some companies who don't, who use it to, so, you know, a certain degree. We want them to use it more. What are the blockers? So I think identifying those questions is important, and that is the iteration loop that you need to, you know, keep running in your head.
And like you also said that, you know, real behavior is real behavior, and you can't really change it. And sometimes customers will say something, but behave in a different way. And some will agree and some will not, right? So it to a lot of like founders, it feels like a just that. Like of course, if you have infinite time and money, you would run experiments for everything, and you'll sort of convert everything into experimentation. But you sort of also need to have an intuition of saying, hey, I feel like this is gonna work. Like, is it just, you know, just complex intuition that we build and you ultimately trust that, or is there some sign?
Intuition building happens the quicker you iterate, right? So when you, like, if you were to imagine this spectrum, when you start off, you don't trust your own intuition. You're like, I haven't really seen the world. I've talked to like 10 customers. What do I know? Right? So you lean more on experimentation. Over time, you develop a bigger worldview, right? Like now, for example, we have reached a point where Postman can play a thought leadership role in how companies collaborate on APIs, right? So now we have more agency with regard to, you know, how enterprises behave, right? Because we can talk to an enterprise, even if they don't use Postman, and say, okay, this is your API landscape. These are the problems you're facing. This is how your API landscape will grow. Because we have seen bigger companies work with APIs. So that spectrum will shift, right? Your, like, the value of your intuition goes up over time. But that only starts happening if you start iterating fast from day one.
When did you feel like, you know, Postman is taking off? Like, at what point you feel like, okay, now we're on to something?
Like, I think at every point, like, you look at any graph and you zoom out, you see this, and you're like, this is the inflection point. And you zoom out, you're like, maybe that is not the inflection point, this is the inflection point.
So was it that, hey, this was a side project, and through a Stack Overflow post, it felt like, hey, this is gonna work? Was it that you sensed something and then you jumped off to build a company out of a project?
Yeah, I think, yeah. So we certainly had a lot of sort of traction as in that hobby project stage, for sure. Like, as I said, when we got our seed round, we had about 350 or 400K users on our Chrome store. Like, that was I think the thing that got us our seed round, that convinced investors. And I think that itself was, like, for me at least, that was like a huge number. Right? Like, 500,000 users. That's so many people. And then I think that feeling, I think, never went away. Right? The feeling of the largeness of the user base, how important. I think one thing that we didn't realize is how important Postman is to people. So I think one incident, 2018, we had our first in-person user conference in the US. And these two guys had flown from New Zealand, right? Like 12-hour flight from New Zealand to SF just to attend like a 4-hour talk. And we're like, you know, this is real, right? That was the first time we had actually met like hundreds of Postman users in a single venue, right? Prior to that, it was online and email. But when you meet like real people who have, you know, paid money and sat in an airplane seat for 11 hours to come talk to you, I think that was one moment, okay, this is real, right? Like, there's definitely something here, and it has this huge user base and huge potential. So I think for me, that was one moment that I regard as important to realize the scale we were at.
Thanks so much, Abhijit,
no problem.
for doing
Wonderful
this.
to have this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Gaurav and Abhishek, for asking great questions.
Thank you, Abhishek.